Terastalization will remain legal in Generation 9. When Tera was announced for Gen 9, players' first reaction was, how can this possibly be balanced? Offensive sweepers powering up to 2 times power or switching types to avoid a weakness threatened to take over the metagame before it even began. Tera Blast brought back the unpredictable nature of hidden power, but made it even stronger and usable by both physical and special attackers. Not only that, but a Tera Pokemon still kept its original attacking types, meaning it got stab on up to 3 types at once. But once Gen 9 OU dropped on Pokemon Showdown, players began to adapt. Defensive Pokemon utilized Tera types like Water, Fairy, Dark, and Steel to stop sweepers in their tracks. Pokemon that changed type could surprise on one turn, but get countered the next turn, just like any other. Smart strategy allowed for scouting and predicting of your opponent's Tera types, and don't forget, you can only do it once. 2 years later, Smogon is announcing that terastalization will not be suspected or changed through the end of Gen 9. The discussion has been a long one. Tera was suspect tested in OU early in 2023, and remained legal after a public vote. Players also considered options like revealing Tera types at the team preview, but no clear option outweighed the simplicity of just keeping it legal. With the question answered first in OU, lower tiers and Ubers followed suit. After that, other Pokemon suspects in DLC kept the discussion alive, as players wondered which was a bigger problem, the Pokemon itself or the Tera mechanic. Tera and Tera Blast were key talking points during discussions like the Volcarona Quick Ban in OU and the Miraidon suspect in Ubers. But eventually, survey results mentioning Tera dropped to a mere 25% of players by mid-2024. For the better players, utilizing Tera became a part of mastering the game. With the metagames now in their 3rd year, tiering leadership has decided to make it clear that Tera isn't going anywhere. This means that players can focus on discussing whatever Pokemon they personally think are broken, without wondering whether a Tera ban might be the answer. If Gliscor is really getting you down, you can ban him no matter what type he currently is. However, Tera Blast as a move is still a topic of discussion. This decision affects all of Smogon's official tiers. That means OU, RU, UU, NU, PU, Little Cup, Ubers, and Doubles. It does not affect Monotype and Draft, who tier separately from the main tiers, nor does it affect National Decks, other metagames like Hackmons, or other unofficial tiers. Tiering discussions march on, with OU leader Finchinator saying, "Progress is still on the horizon, and I am confident we will have more suspects." And on that note, here's Finchinator for some further discussion on Tera.
Hey guys, it's Finchinator here. I'm joined by overused player SRN, who's been a forum moderator and a high-level tournament player for a number of years now, and we're gonna have a bit of a spirited discussion on terastalization now that the announcement that it's gonna be remaining in overuse for the rest of the generation is out. So SRN, you could introduce yourself and let us know how you feel on the topic.
Thank you, Finch. I believe you're being a little generous with the number of years I've been a good tournament player, but I'm very happy to be here because I've been one of the first, foremost, loudest critics of Tera in OU. So I've long been in the acceptance phase of the 5 stages of grief when it comes to Tera remaining in this tier. This is just the nail in the coffin, but we're here to talk about the history of Tera, why it's good, why it's bad, and believe we're the best 2 people to do it.
Definitely. So yeah, I understand, a lot of people have had very different opinions on the topic. In fact, we have pretty different opinions on the topic. Earlier on in this generation, actually, I was more so in favor of action. During the first suspect test, when action and no action were kind of the 2 parameters, I voted in favor of action alongside 59% of people. I think it's down to 58 after a couple people were retroactively removed for getting wrecked illegally, which is another topic for another day. But ultimately, I didn't want an outright ban, which boiled down to kind of be the only type of valid action, a lot of people would argue. But I was kind of curious to see what would happen without, the full-fledged Tera. But the more I adjusted and the more I played, the more I actually found there to be some skillful components to Tera. For example, you could use it as a team-building asset if you maybe want a second check or counter to something in a pinch, but it does come at a large opportunity cost, so there's some strategy there. And I'm sure SRN will get on this himself, but you could argue, of course, it goes both ways in the sense that makes it harder to make progress or cover all options offensively as well. So there's definitely some nuance, there's some pushback on that. I'm sure SRN, has a strong opinion on that. But for me, earlier on in the generation, it was a very hard adjustment, especially as someone who's played, other generations and is kind of more of a basic player. But, I guess the more I played, the more I got used to it. But I think a lot of people have actually the opposite reaction. The more they played, the more they disliked it. So I'm curious to see what your perspective was on the whole topic and also the progression of it throughout the generation.
I mean, I agree with you in the sense that the more you play SV, the better Tera feels. Because, casual players especially, what they don't like about Tera, from what I have spoken to them and from what I can glean, the issue is that it feels random sometimes. When you don't play SV, when you don't know the Teras, when you don't know exactly the team structures, it might be obvious to me or you, but when you lose to some random Tera, it feels bad to lose to something random, at least that you think is random in a competitive setting. Yeah. So you think you have that Roaring Moon locked down, and then, nowadays we're seeing some Tera ground sets oh, I have a Sticky Barb Clefable, no big deal, right? It'll handle Roaring Moon. But what if it's bulky, DD, Tera ground, knock EQ roost? Screwed. It feels random. And so that I understand. And I do think that's kind of the flip side of Tera raising the skill ceiling of this tier, is that it's also a lot harder for casual players to get into and enjoy this tier, because you do need to grind SVOU to stay on top of this tier.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's gonna feel bad.
Oh, definitely. And I think that's actually part of, and maybe this is going to sound elitist, but that's part of why I like it, because it rewards knowledge of the ins and outs of the tier. It rewards repetition. Personally, for me, I've always been a grinder, a tryhard. I've played on the ladder dozens of games every single week, as SRN and some of my friends know, probably to a fault, to the point where I'm hiding myself on alts, talking in foreign languages and all sorts of crazy antics. But when you talk about, let's say, Tera Ground Roaring Moon, which is a great example, it absolutely has a different set of checks and counters than Tera Flying Roaring Moon. You could use a Sticky Barb Clefable to negate the damage of acrobatics after one hit and also start to whittle it down, whereas Earthquake, obviously that damage isn't dependent on the item and there's a totally different dynamic. But there also is the flip side of that, where Tera Ground is, still, for example, neutral against Earthquake, or it's not resistance against Body Press, and there's give and take. So I think a big thing is preserving your assets and timing your own Tera well. For example, if you blow your own Tera against a Tera Ground Roaring Moon, then you might have less counterplay against it, and you're only going to be able to cover one of 2 or 3 or even 4 possible sets. So I think it adds a layer of strategy, which you were alluding to, but being able to really consider all possibilities on certain Pokemon definitely is harder, and it's probably contributed, almost definitely contributed, honestly, to us having more bans than ever before. And I guess this is kind of segueing off of this topic, but also keeping it on the same topic in a weird sense, in that we've had almost 20 bans, if I recall correctly, from overuse, and a couple of Pokemon have returned to OU, like Roaring Moon, which we just discussed, like Gliscor, and also, prior generation Ubers like Darkrai have thankfully returned from the Ubers tier. But with that said, there have been a ton of bans, and you could look at something like Chen Pao and say, oh, that was going to be broken regardless, right? It was a very strong Pokemon, didn't necessarily depend on Tera. But then you look at things like Annihilate or Espathra, or even Magirna. I guess Regieleki would probably be a better example, and be like, oh, with Tera in hand, they are bonkers. It's a non-contest, if you will. I'm sure you have feeling. I know you've been pretty outspoken about certain things being ban-worthy. So what do you think? Do you think that it has contributed to tiering being expedited? Do you think that that's good or bad, or kind of can go either way?
I think what it boils down to, obviously it's more bans needed because it raises the overall power level of the tier. But the single defining factor, there are a few exceptions, but it's that when you can use Tera to kill something unexpected, that's usually fair. I think the player base can tolerate that, as long as it's limited to 1 kill.
No snowballing.
Yeah, that's the key issue, right? Perfect example of this. Cinderace. Terra Blast Ice. You're surprising the Gliscor, kill, boom. Nobody is complaining about that, even though you could argue it's unexpected, it's hard to prepare for, it's difficult to scout. That's all true.
Yes.
But there are good trade-offs to running or trying to actually fit in Terra Blast on Cinderace and actually burning your Terra to changing it to a pure ice typing, which is pretty shit. And there's trade-offs to a point that nobody would really complain about that.
Agreed.
Getting one surprise kill, that's okay.
I think so.
But the problem, of course, is when you can get a surprise sweep, when you can set up somewhere that you shouldn't be able to, and you can end the game on the spot. And I would argue a majority of our bans have been Pokemon that can abuse Terra to end games in places where it's not really something that's considered fair. So I'm talking about Volcarona, Gouging Fire, Sneasler, and, there are exceptions I want to note out, like Gliscor. That's a pretty notable exception, but I can also argue that there are reasons that the suspects of Kyurem did not succeed is because it's not really that efficient at abusing Terra to just completely close out games. It's the same reason why I don't think a Water Pond suspect would be successful. Same reason why I don't think a Goldengo suspect would be successful. There's a lot of counterplay to like King Gambit. That's because boosting speed is also a big part of this, in my opinion. So I think the defining factor is when things snowball out of control. And to an extent, I would argue that we are still continuing to see the effects of that today, because there are a lot of different Pokemon that can abuse Terra in a lot of diverse ways right now, such as Dragonite and Roaring Moon. They can grab 2 DDs sometimes with the well-timed Terra, and they can close out games so easily. So it's an issue that, well, we're gonna deal with forever now, and we definitely have to constantly be cognizant of, is this too efficient at snowballing, or is there still sufficient counterplay? We actually sparred a little bit as a community on the topic of Gouging Fire. On the first suspect, the popular sets at the time were the bulky Morning Sun Breaking Swipe DD sets, which, that turned out to be a fad. It just wasn't that efficient. People foolishly thought that the booster energy Dragon Dance offensive sets weren't that good anymore, and then it came back around. They discovered Terra Dragon Outrage, Terra Blast Fairy. Then people decided, oh, wait a second, this is actually way too efficient at snowballing and cleaning out games. This is broken. And then it got banned by a vast majority on the second test.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you that there is a fine line between potentially luring one kill, especially because the opponent can easily do that with most Terras, or stop a kill or force a revenge kill, versus snowball. Because when you get one kill, the game is seldom over unless it's the very end, in which case you've preserved your Terra to the extent that it's a reward for doing so if you got to a point where you could do that, right? But on the flip side, if you snowball out of control and get 3 kills or sweep, the game's over. So, yeah, and I think there's a strong correlation between two things in Terra that have prompted more bans than ever before. Would be recovery and being able to boost speed. Kyurem is perhaps an outlier because even after one Dragon Dance, it's slower than a lot of speed boost Pokemon and also vulnerable to priority. The difference, for example, between a Kyurem and a Gouging Fire is Gouging Fire's got more natural physical bulk and doesn't have as, I guess, useless a defensive profile. With that in mind, though, Kyurem obviously has gotten 58, 59% a couple times, so even a Pokemon like Kyurem, on the physical side of the spectrum, not even the stronger of the two, has already been pushed towards almost broken levels. Meanwhile, look at things like Sneasler with Unburden, which is a pretty fragile Pokemon, Magearna with Shift Gear, a Spathra with Speed Boost. You could even potentially discuss something like Baxcalibur with Dragon Dance, but that was also just a very strong Pokemon. But the point is that these Pokemon that can either, have that longevity, like Gliscor when it initially got banned, or the speed boosting, like the Gouging Fires, like the Espathras, like the Magearnas, can snowball out of control. There's some permanency to the impact they'll have on the game. Whereas, obviously, getting one kill, you can't use that Pokemon anymore. There's permanency there, but there's recourse. We see a lot of Tera exchanges where maybe I will get a kill with my Tera Flying Roaring Moon against something that I otherwise couldn't kill, like a Great Tusk, or a full health Kyurem, or a 60% Tinglu if I'm +1, whatever it may be. But now all of a sudden, I'm weak to a Thunderclap from Raging Bolt, or in Turn Normal Extreme Speed takes me out, or whatever it may be. there's trade-off there, right? Like, you could get one surprise kill, and maybe the kill on that Great Tusk opens up for my King Gambit, but my opponent still has their Tera to either get a kill of their own, or potentially stop the King Gambit, now that the King Gambit can't Tera Fairy and become neutral to, like, a Headlong Rush or an Earthquake. So, I think the one-for-one, the give and take, or, you know, the, oh, this sweeper got one kill, but it can't sweep me now because I could revenge kill it, or I can check it with this Tera, is fine, and a skillful positioning mechanism within the game, and honestly, I think has raised the ceiling of competitive Pokemon, as maybe some Tera haters will be pulling their hair out at me saying that, but I do think it's very skillful. But I think on more Pokemon than ever before, it's broken, it's too overpowered, and it raises both the offensive power level, but also when you're running something like a Dragon Dance plus Roost Dragonite, or a Dragon Dance plus Morning Sun Gouging Fire to turn back the clock a little bit, it can completely turn something that plays like an offensive behemoth into a crazy defensive wall. Suddenly my Dragonite is able to stall out a Great Tusk, or scout out the full set on an Ogerpon Wellspring, or whatever it may be. Suddenly my Dragonite can wall a Choice Specs Dragapult in the Draco Meteor, some Tera Fairy, and get 2 Dragon Dances, and in the games, that's that. So there's give and take there, and I think you hit on it really well, the distinction between getting one kill versus snowballing. And I think we've talked a lot about the offensive component, but defensive, and where we're talking about these roost sets, I think defensive terastalization is also very important. And I actually don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think, it makes stall too good or anything like that. I think that it actually is the opposite, in that it makes these offensive juggernauts have different defensive profiles. I'm sure, and I'll pivot to you for a moment, you could think of a dozen examples off the top of your head of right now of Pokemon like a Swords Dance, Gliscor, Dragon Dance, Dragonite changing their types. Do you think that having that in the game is a net positive or a net negative? So I think there's arguments on both sides. I'm curious to hear what your take on that is.
It's really hard to draw a good line in the sand. I think when it comes to using Tera with setup sweepers, you constantly have to kind of vibe check the player base and the meta and just the options in the team builder. Like, can this be handled with, I think Encore is a great move that has risen in popularity so much in this generation, specifically because revenge killing by just attacking isn't so reliable anymore. And in part due to the King Gambit's prevalence with Sucker Punch as well, Encore has just come out to be such a great way to neuter a slower sweeper, regardless of what Tera they use, regardless of their priority that may be conditional like Sucker Punch or Thunderclap. So I think being slow enough to be encored is a huge important determining factor on whether or not a setup sweeper that can use Tera is going to end up broken or not. The number of exceptions to that rule, as far as like fast versus slow setup sweepers, that actually ended up being broken, I feel like Ursaluna Blood Moon was the only one that you could truly call like a slow broken setup sweeper in this tier. Maybe you could argue Arcaludon, but that's not really a setup sweeper in the sense that Electroshot is just like, that's a pretty cracked move. So like those are the 1.5 exceptions I would give you. And Ursaluna Blood Moon is truly like nearly perfectly designed Mon. Like, holy shit, it is so strong and just so bulky. It was crazy. So that's how bad it needs to get in order for a slow setup sweeper to be like considered truly broken. So I think speed is a really important defining factor when it comes to the setup Tera abusers.
Definitely. So yeah, and I'm inclined to agree with you, especially with this generation being faster than ever. We talk so much about power creep, but also it's speed crap. And not in a sense that, I'm going to run 4 speed EVs on my both Goldango to outrun your 0 speed EV Goldango, but it's speed crap in a sense that now we see conventionally fast Pokemon, like let's take Weavile for example, and Weavile isn't a top 5, maybe even a top 7 fast Pokemon if you consider it, a top 10 really. You got Zamazenta, you have the potential for booster speed on Tusk, Valiant, you have something like Deoxys Speed, Dragapult, a booster speed Iron Moth, the list goes on and on and on. And it's crazy how fast the metagames become, and in a vacuum, it's fine. It's just the metagame having more revenge killing options, but then when you factor in Tera and boosting moves and how strong it is, it's the perfect storm for tiering chaos. It's the perfect storm for low kicks to become an A-tier Pokemon and overused. Priority has really become the great equalizer in a lot of versions of SVOU, in my opinion. And thankfully, it being so prevalent on the aforementioned low kicks, on Dragonite, on King Gambit, even potentially on something like, Weavile or Scizor, which maybe can be seen as more fringe, Rillaboom, them having that allows for you to potentially stop something from snowballing out of the way. The issue is that when we're in a position where we have that reliance on priority, we have that reliance on fast Encore users, we have that reliance on using so much Tera Ghost or Tera Fairy or even Tera Flying for the sake of immunities, that is a volatile position. We haven't seen that in any other generation. And that's why the balance of SVOU with Tera is always going to be more delicate than other generations. And I don't know how often you've played Sword and Shield or Sun and Moon overused, but I think you'd agree, SRN, right, that the balance they've had is nothing like the balance we had, right?
Yeah, it's a totally different ball game. Revenge killing is just different in that it's reliable. Like, there was no such thing as you switching out your King Gambit in front of a Great Tusk because you're afraid of Sarah Blast Fairy. You just attack it, kill it.
Correct.
It was simpler, but that's not to say that it's better or worse.
No, I mean, the strategy to saying, okay, I want to use my Tera on this turn to live a Headlong Rush and then kill it with Tera Blast Fairy, but now maybe I have this weakened King Gambit in the back that's a Fairy type, and now I don't have a Ghost Resist, so now I need to find another way out against the Goldango, for example. And maybe that Goldango, even to make matters worse, can Tera Fairy itself to neutralize my own Sucker Punch on a Revenge Kill it, and there's the give and take. So some people are like, oh, that's why you never Tera first, but they've actually done some tests on that, and that's not really a huge element. Obviously, you have to Tera in some positions. It just is what it is, right? But I think it more so, there's this sub-metagame within the metagame that the more experienced you are, the better you are at evaluating risk-reward, the better you are at understanding how to pilot your team, the better you are at using Tera, and the more likely you are to win the game. And that goes back to kind of the thesis that if we're going to keep Tera, which we are, then you're going to have as much experience as possible to thrive. The best players this generation have been those who have frequented the ladder and played a lot of reps in, and it's not something you can just pick up and potentially do well, whereas something like SSOU, if you just load up sample teams on the day of a tournament, you could probably do well. In SV, even if you're a conventionally better player, you need those games under your belt.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of nuance in deciding when to use your Tera and how you're going to get the most value out of it. Definitely, I would say you should err on the side of caution, trying to scout information, maybe saving your Tera for an opportunity that might need it later down the road. But I've also played a lot of games and seen players just kind of never use their Tera in a good way. They hold on to it too late, and then in the end, it just kind of does nothing. It's ultimately your best resource that you have going into a battle, and you have to use it. It's a complete waste if you don't use it well. So you have to preserve it to best navigate the game, but you also should think every game, how am I going to use Tera? Even on preview, just take a look at your Teras and think, these are good, these aren't. And that's a really key aspect of game planning in this tier.
Definitely. So yeah, we're gonna wrap this up soon. I guess Srn, while we got you, do you have any final thoughts on Tera staying in SVOU, or any predictions as to next developments in the metagame?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer both of those questions. First off, I actually don't think the tier is going to change that much, because if we know that Tera is legal, I didn't see that much support for Kyurem or Wellspring or Tera Blast. I think the tier is kind of in as good of a place as it's going to be. I don't expect that much change, and I know people are pushing for Kyurem, I know people are pushing for Wellspring, but I just don't think it has that mainstream broken appeal. They need to have the snowballing power. If they don't have it, I just don't think it's going to come through. And as for last thoughts, every option in your builder is something that you also have to prepare for. So if you got a lot of different Teras at your disposal, guess what? Your opponent does too. And you can't prepare for everything, so it's going to increase variance. That's just the nature of the beast.
All right. I will leave you with one bold prediction. That bold prediction is I think Kyurem gets suspected for a third time. I think I will vote ban for a third time, and I do not think it will be banned for a third and final time.
Yeah, I agree.
So that is my bold prediction. That's not going to happen anytime in the next couple weeks in all likelihood. But yeah, I'll leave anything else to the future, and we'll have to wait and see. Until then, SRN, OU tournament player, moderator, all around good guy. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to talk with us. I hope you have a great day, and thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. It was great fun to talk with this.
Awesome. All right, guys. Terastalization will remain legal in Scarlet and Violet Overused, as well as various other tiers. Thank you so much. Bye now.